The war should have taken his life, but instead, it took his soul. His loyal K-9 vanished in the chaos, leaving behind scars no one could see. Haunted by guilt and loss, the Navy SEAL searches for answers and stumbles upon a buried secret that was never meant to be found. But when the truth rises from the deep, he realizes the enemy he's hunting is the commander he once saluted. Now, faith is his final weapon, and only God can decide who walks out of the storm. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. The afternoon sun pressed down over Jacksonville, Florida, soft and heavy, coating the Airfield Museum in a golden haze that shimmered across the glass displays and old aircraft shells. Inside the hangar, among silent relics of wars long past, Jake Turner stood still, his thoughts noisier than the hum of the air conditioning above. He was on medical leave, officially a temporary rest to recover from a mission gone wrong. But everyone in his unit knew that kind of rest wasn't just for the body. His shoulder wound had long closed. What hadn't healed were the memories of that night. The ambush, the screaming, the blood on his hands, and the image that haunted every dream. Ranger, his loyal German shepherd, being carried away into the smoke by a stranger. The museum was quiet, except for the soft shuffle of shoes on polished floors. Jake's boots echoed against the concrete as he moved past the rows of rifles, helmets, and dusty plaques until something caught his eye. A glass case tucked in the corner, half forgotten, with a single weapon inside. It wasn't polished like the others. The M4A1 rifle inside was old, its metal eaten by rust, the barrel crooked as if bent by heat. But what drew Jake closer wasn't the weapon's decay. It was the faint, almost invisible engraving near the trigger, a snarling panther's head with eyes like slits of light. His heart clenched as if something had gripped it from inside. He knew that mark. He had seen it before. He reached out instinctively, fingertips brushing the glass. And in that moment, the air around him changed. The echo of the hangar faded, replaced by the deafening roar of gunfire, the whip of ocean wind, and the acrid scent of burning fuel. The scene from months ago burst back into his mind, an island somewhere off the Pacific, humid and hostile, the jungle trembling from explosions. His SEAL team had landed there to intercept a weapons exchange between smugglers and rogue contractors. Everything had gone wrong within minutes. The first explosion tore through the clearing, throwing Jake into the dirt. When he rose, half his team was down, and Ranger was bleeding from his flank, but still growling, defiant, ready to fight. "Ranger, heal!" Jake had shouted over the chaos, but the dog ignored him, lunging toward the tree line where shadows moved fast between bursts of muzzle flash. Then the stranger appeared, a figure in a dark tactical gear, face hidden, moving with inhuman precision. Bullets tore the leaves around them, yet the man didn't flinch. He turned his rifle sideways, an M4 with that same panther emblem shining through soot, and fired a clean burst that dropped 3 gunmen closing in on Jake. Then he looked back, just for a heartbeat, and Jake caught the glint of pale eyes behind the mask. Without a word, the man crouched beside Ranger, checked the wound, and hoisted the dog into his arms. "Wait, that's my partner." Jake had tried to run after him, but another blast shook the ground. Dirt and fire swallowed his vision. When he woke later, his comms were dead, his team gone, and Ranger was nowhere to be found. The only thing left was a cracked magazine plate engraved with that same symbol. Intelligence later said there were no records of any Allied units in that area, no extraction flights, no survivors beyond Jake himself. The official report called it a failed interception, but Jake knew better. Someone had been there and had taken his dog. Back in the museum, the memory dissolved like smoke. Jake exhaled shakily, realizing his hand had been pressed so hard to the glass that his knuckles were white. A voice broke the silence behind him. "Sir, please don't lean on the display," came the crisp tone of Captain Miller, one of the base's young officers standing near the F-35 exhibit. He was clean-cut, probably proud of his rank and the pristine fighter jet gleaming behind him. "That rifle's over 50 years old. It's fragile." Jake didn't look at him. "Where did this come from?" he asked quietly. Miller frowned. "That? Recovered from a wreckage off the Keys. Some smuggler's ship went down with a bunch of old gear. Why?" Jake's voice dropped lower. "Who brought it here?" "Some naval recovery team," Miller said with a shrug. "It's junk, if you ask me." But Jake wasn't listening anymore. His thoughts swirled. Keys, wreckage, smuggler ship. Every detail stabbed at him with a cold familiarity. The island operation had taken place just south of that same region. Could it be connected? Could the man with the Panther rifle have resurfaced? He stared at the weapon again, tracing the faint shape of the Panther through the glass, and something hardened inside him. The military had told him to rest, to heal, to prepare for the next assignment. But rest was impossible when pieces of his past kept surfacing like wreckage from deep water. Ranger was out there somewhere, alive or maybe not, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the dog's fate and this rifle's reappearance were tied together. He remembered Ranger's eyes that night, loyal, unyielding, the eyes of a creature that refused to die even when everything burned. Jake had trained that dog from a pup, trusted him in storms and silence alike. Losing him wasn't just losing a partner. It was losing the last part of himself that believed in innocence. As Miller walked away, Jake remained motionless, his reflection hovering in the glass beside the rifle. He saw two versions of himself there, the soldier who had followed orders and the man who now stood in their shadow questioning everything. The longer he looked, the more he felt the pull, the sense that this wasn't over. The past wasn't done with him. When the museum lights dimmed for closing, Jake turned to leave. But before stepping out, he took one last glance at the weapon. For an instant, as the light flickered, it seemed the engraved Panther gleamed faintly, as though alive. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he knew symbols mattered in war. They were promises, warnings, and memories carved into steel. Outside, the evening had cooled. The city lights blinked faintly across the harbor, reflected in the still water. Jake pulled out his phone and stared at the old encrypted message still saved in his drafts, one he'd never sent to command. Ranger may be alive. Permission to investigate. His thumb hovered over the screen, but he locked it again without sending. Some truths had to be found off the record. He looked out across the docks, the wind tugging at his sleeves. Somewhere out there, the man with the Panther rifle had vanished into the waves, and Ranger had vanished with him. Jake clenched his fists. Leave or not, orders or not, he would find them both. The morning haze over the Florida coastline blurred the line between sea and sky. From his small rented room near the harbor, Jake Turner watched the waves drift lazily, the same waves that had once carried bodies, weapons and secrets ashore. Sleep had been elusive again. Memories refused to let go. The rusted rifle in the museum had ripped open an old wound, and the more he tried to push it aside, the louder the ghosts became. Ranger's bark still echoed somewhere in the back of his mind, a call half memory, half guilt. He spent the next 2 days digging through files, leaning on contacts from his SEAL unit, quietly pulling favors without drawing attention from command. Officially, Jake was still on medical leave, expected to rest, heal, and prepare for reassignment. Unofficially, he was tracking a weapon that didn't belong to any record. Through an old intel clerk named Ramirez, retired now, running a quiet fishing shop near Mayport, Jake learned the rifle had been retrieved from a wrecked smuggling vessel 2 years ago near the Florida Keys. No survivors, no cargo manifest, just scattered bodies and rusted crates that were quickly sealed away. The ship's name was the Crimson Tide. Ramirez was an old friend of Jake's first commander, a man hardened by years in shadow operations. When Jake met him at the docks, the old man's hands trembled slightly as he cleaned a reel, but his voice was steady. "You don't want to dig too deep into that, son," he said. "Some things at the bottom of the sea are meant to stay there." Jake looked him in the eye. "I lost something down there, and maybe it's still breathing." Ramirez studied him for a long time, then nodded. "You were always like your father, never knew when to stop." That sentence hit Jake harder than he expected. He rarely spoke of his father, a Marine pilot who had died when Jake was 9, during a rescue mission off Guam. The last thing Jake remembered was watching his mother receive a folded flag. It was perhaps why he had joined the Navy in the first place, to chase ghosts and finish stories left undone. Ramirez gave him a flash drive. "Old Coast Guard sonar data. It shows debris fields that were never logged. If you want to find your dog, or whoever took him, you start there." That night, Jake sat in his motel room, maps spread across the table, tracing lines between the coordinates Ramirez had given him. The wreck was within reach, just a few hours' boat ride from the mainland. He opened his laptop and cross-referenced the weapon ID number from the museum photo. Something strange appeared. A small symbol, identical to the Panther engraving, was listed in an outdated classified file from the 1970s, attached to a covert unit called the Night Reapers. The file ended abruptly, marked "Redacted for National Security." No commander listed, no history, just one phrase under its mission header: "Extraction in Denied Territory. Ghost Protocol." Jake leaned back, rubbing his temples. The same emblem had shown up decades apart, on 2 different weapons, tied to men who shouldn't exist. Could the man who carried Ranger have belonged to something that wasn't officially part of the Navy anymore? Or was this some new player using an old ghost's name? The next morning, he drove to the Port Authority under the pretense of checking in with medical transport units. There, he met Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins, a naval intelligence officer assigned to logistics oversight. She was sharp, calm, and observant, someone who had clearly spent her career learning to read what wasn't said. Jake had met her once during an extraction in Syria. She owed him a favor after he had covered her team's retreat. When she saw him, her brow furrowed. "You're supposed to be off duty, Turner. What are you looking for?" Jake slid a photo of the rusted rifle across the table. "This weapon came from a wreck near the Keys. I need access to the salvage report." She scanned the photo, lips tightening. You're chasing ghosts." "Maybe, but one of them took my dog." Jenkins hesitated, then sighed. The Crimson Tide wasn't just a smuggling vessel. It was flagged under a shell company tied to a defense contractor, Halverson Dynamics. They handle weapons testing for the government. The report was buried before it ever reached public logs. Jake's stomach twisted. So someone wanted it forgotten. "Someone high enough to make sure it stayed that way," she said. "I'll send you the location of a contact who worked on the recovery crew. He's retired now, lives in Marathon. Name's Leo Grant. But be careful, Jake. He's the kind of man who doesn't talk unless he has a reason, and he's seen things that broke tougher men." That evening, Jake stood at the harbor, staring out over the dark water. The sea glimmered faintly under a half-moon, vast and quiet. But he could feel something beneath its calm, like a presence watching from the depths. He remembered the stranger's eyes that night in the jungle, pale and steady, and the faint sound of rangers panting as he was carried away. Every instinct told him this trail would lead somewhere dangerous, somewhere buried deep inside the kind of operations even SEALs weren't meant to touch. He booked a small charter vessel for the next morning, hired through a local diver named Kyle, a former rescue swimmer who'd left the Navy after losing a teammate during a failed recovery mission. Kyle didn't ask questions. He recognized Jake's posture, that haunted focus soldiers carry when they've lost too much. As they prepared for departure, Jake checked his gear, a waterproof case, the flash drive Ramirez gave him, and a single old dog tag hanging from his neck. Rangers. Before boarding, he looked back toward the city lights fading behind him. Somewhere out there, in the blue-black stretch of water, lay a wreck full of answers. Somewhere beyond that, a ghost carrying his dog had vanished into legend. He climbed aboard, the boat engine rumbling to life, cutting through the still surface as dawn began to bleed into the horizon. The wind hit his face, sharp and alive. For the first time since that night, Jake felt the pulse of purpose again, not orders, not duty, but something deeper. Miles away, deep under the waves, a sonar buoy blinked red. A faint metallic ping echoed in the deep. Someone, or something, had noticed his movement. The midday sun glared over the Florida Keys, bleaching the sea into glass. Jake Turner stood at the bow of the small vessel as it cut through turquoise waves toward Marathon Island. The water was calm, deceptively calm, as if guarding the ruins below. It had been 2 days since he'd left Jacksonville, and the coordinates Ramirez gave him had led to more than one sleepless night. Each mile brought him closer to the truth and to the shadow of the past that had stolen his dog. Kyle, the charter captain, worked quietly behind him, steering the vessel with the practiced ease of a man who'd once trusted the sea and later learned to fear it. He'd spoken little since they left port, but as they neared the island, he finally broke the silence. "You're sure about this?" he asked, not looking up from the controls. "That place has been off-limits since the Navy shut it down. Locals say it's haunted." Jake gave a humorless smile. "I don't believe in ghosts." "Then believe in men who made them," Kyle muttered, cutting the engine. The boat drifted closer to the shore, an expanse of white sand and mangroves twisting like dark fingers. The air smelled of salt and rust. In the distance stood the remains of an old research station, half collapsed, its radio tower bent from storms. Jake grabbed his gear and stepped into the waist-high surf, the water cool against his scars. They moved inland through the silence, broken only by the call of distant gulls. As they reached the station, Jake felt a strange pull in his chest, familiar yet unexplainable. Something about this place reminded him of the night of the ambush, of the chaos, of Ranger's fading bark. He crouched, touching a patch of mud, noticing faint paw prints hardened in the dried earth. His pulse spiked. "Jake," Kyle said quietly, pointing toward the crumbling building. A figure stood in the doorway, a woman unmoving, watching them. She stepped forward, slowly, hands visible, cautious, but unafraid. "You shouldn't be here," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes carried weight, the kind only those who had lost too much could bear. Jake straightened. "Neither should you. Who are you?" The woman hesitated before answering. "Ava Cole." The name hit Jake like a gust of cold air. Ramirez had mentioned a Captain Cole, a name buried in the old Night Reaper files. He studied her for a long moment. "Cole, your father served in the Navy, didn't he?" Her gaze flickered. "He did, until they made sure no one remembered him." Ava Cole wasn't just any local. She was the daughter of Captain Richard Cole, commander of the covert aviation unit, the Night Reapers, a unit erased from history after a mission gone wrong in 1971. Her father had flown the final rescue that was never recorded, his helicopter shot down deep in enemy territory. The official report listed him as missing in action. But Ava had spent her life chasing scraps of truth, growing up under whispers of treason and cover-ups that destroyed her family's name. Jake saw in her the same look he carried, the weight of an unfinished story. "You're looking for something here, too," he said. Ava nodded. "I'm looking for the men who killed my father." Before Jake could reply, a low growl echoed from behind her. A shadow moved through the doorway, and then Jake saw him. Ranger. The German shepherd stepped into the light, eyes alert but hesitant. His body carried new scars, but there was no mistaking the steady confidence in his posture. The dog froze, recognizing Jake instantly. The air between them thickened, neither daring to move first. Jake knelt slowly. "Ranger, boy, it's me." The dog's tail twitched once, uncertain, then twice. Finally, he moved forward, head low, pressing against Jake's chest with a soft whine that broke whatever composure Jake had left. Months of silence dissolved into that single sound. He held the dog tightly, closing his eyes. "You made it," he whispered. Ava looked away, giving them space. When Jake finally stood, he asked, "You found him? Why?" "Because he found me first," she replied quietly. "He was half dead near the wreck of the Crimson Tide. I took him in. The vet said he shouldn't have survived, but he did." She paused. "He led me here. Every time I tried to leave the island, he refused. Always came back." Jake's mind raced. "You knew about the ship?" Ava nodded. "It wasn't just a smuggling vessel. It carried equipment from Halverson Dynamics, the same company tied to the Night Reapers. My father once accused them of stealing classified tech. 2 weeks later, his helicopter vanished. And now?" She looked toward the mangroves, where the breeze carried the faint smell of diesel and decay. "They're using these islands again." Kyle had been standing guard near the boat, scanning the horizon. "We've got company," he called out, raising his binoculars. 3 speedboats inbound, armed. Jake's instincts kicked in instantly. "We need to move." Ava motioned toward a tunnel beneath the old station. "This way. There's an escape route that leads to the West Cove." They ran through the narrow concrete hallway, Ranger trotting beside Jake, alert but silent. As they moved deeper underground, the sound of engines faded, replaced by dripping water and the hum of old generators. The tunnel opened into a small chamber filled with rusted crates. Jake brushed dust from one and froze. The markings were military issue, naval ordnance. Inside were sealed containers labeled HD-7 Biotracking Unit, Halverson Dynamics. "What the hell is this?" Jake muttered. Ava's face hardened. Proof that they never stopped. Whatever my father tried to expose, it's still happening. Ranger began to growl softly, ears pricking toward the entrance. Footsteps echoed faintly down the corridor. Ava drew a sidearm from her belt. They followed us. Jake looked toward the crates, then back to her. "We can't fight them here. We take what we can and move." He grabbed a data drive from one of the containers and stuffed it into his vest. The footsteps grew louder, metallic, organized, military. Ranger barked once, sharp and warning. The lights flickered. Jake and Ava exchanged a glance. Whatever waited beyond that tunnel wasn't just smugglers. It was trained, coordinated, and it knew exactly where they were. "Go," Jake said, motioning for Ava to take the lead. Ranger stayed close behind, muscles tensed. They sprinted toward the faint shimmer of daylight ahead. As they reached the exit, a voice boomed from the darkness behind them, calm, deliberate, and chillingly familiar. "You should have stayed in the shadows, Turner." Jake froze. He knew that voice. The sky above Marathon Island was bruised with storm clouds, heavy and bruising the air with the taste of salt and metal. The narrow tunnel shook from the echo of footsteps closing in behind them. Jake Turner pressed his back against the damp concrete, eyes narrowing toward the faint light flickering ahead. Ava Cole crouched beside him, her breathing shallow but steady, her mind racing faster than her pulse. Ranger was between them, low and silent, every muscle coiled like a drawn bowstring. The voice that had come from the darkness still rang in Jake's head, the same deep, deliberate tone that had commanded him years ago. "Commander Briggs," Jake whispered under his breath, the name tasting like ash. He hadn't heard it in nearly 5 years, not since the mission in Kandahar, where Briggs had led their unit into a death trap for a classified objective. Briggs had been declared missing in action soon after, but now the man was alive and hunting him. Ava looked at him sharply. "You know that voice?" Jake nodded grimly. "He used to give me orders." They didn't have time to say more. The beam of a flashlight swept across the tunnel wall. Jake motioned to move. They sprinted toward the far exit, boots splashing through shallow puddles. Behind them came the sound of radio chatter and the click of weapons. Ranger darted ahead, guiding them through a series of narrow passages that opened into a service hatch leading out toward the shoreline. Outside, the storm had broken. The rain lashed down in sheets, driven sideways by the wind. In the distance, the sea churned around a massive silhouette, a cargo vessel, dark against the horizon. It wasn't a civilian ship. Its deck bristled with cranes and sealed containers, and faint floodlights marked the insignia of Halverson Dynamics. Ava's voice was barely audible over the thunder. "That's it. That's where they've been moving the weapons." Jake squinted through the storm. "And maybe where they're making them." Kyle, who had stayed near the cove with the boat, appeared from behind a rock outcrop, soaked and pale. "2 patrols on the beach. They're sweeping the island. We'll have to take the long way through the cliffs." They moved quickly, hugging the ridge line. Ranger led the way, stopping every few steps to scent the wind, his instincts honed from years of combat. Jake trusted that dog's judgment more than any map. When they reached a narrow vantage point overlooking the sea, they stopped. From there, they could see clearly small armed boats moving between the shore and the cargo vessel. Each carried containers, covered in tarps, but clearly military. Ava lifted the binoculars, her expression darkening. Those markings, they're Navy serial codes. My father was right. The Night Reaper operation didn't die. It changed names. Jake's jaw tightened. And Briggs is running it now. They waited until one of the smaller boats broke away from the rest, drifting toward the eastern dock. It was their only chance. Jake and Ava slid down the rocks under cover of the rain, Ranger following like a silent shadow. They reached the dock just as the boat's two-man crew began unloading crates. Jake took one from behind, pulling him silently into the water while Ava disarmed the other with a swift motion, pressing the muzzle of his own weapon against him. "Talk," she demanded. The man hesitated, rain streaming down his face. "We're loading the cargo for Commander Briggs. He's on the main ship. Orders are to leave before dawn. Whatever's in the containers, it's not just weapons." Ava glanced at Jake. "Then we're going aboard." They forced the crewmen to pilot them toward the cargo ship under the cover of storm and night. As the dark hull loomed larger, Jake's pulse steadied into the calm he knew too well, the clarity before battle. He'd been trained for moments like this, when death felt close enough to touch, but far enough to ignore. They climbed the ship's stern ladder, slipping over the railing into the shadows of the main deck. Floodlights cut through the rain, illuminating lines of containers stacked like silent tombs. The ship vibrated faintly, its engines running at low power. Somewhere deep inside, generators hummed. Jake signaled for Ava to follow as they moved along the starboard corridor. They passed a row of sealed cargo doors, each marked with a sequence HD7 bio-tracking unit. It was the same code from the crates they'd found underground. Ava paused beside one and pried open the latch. Inside, among racks of tech equipment and chemical canisters, was something else. Cages, dozens of them, empty, except for scratch marks along the metal floors. Her breath caught. They were testing on animals. Jake's expression hardened. Not just animals, look at this. He pointed at a tag still attached to one of the empty cages. Subject K99, Unit 412, Ranger. Ava turned to him in shock. They were experimenting on him? Or training him, Jake said quietly, anger simmering beneath his calm. That's why they took him alive. Whatever program Halverson's building, they needed survivors. Before they could continue, the ship's PA system crackled to life. A voice echoed across the deck, calm, commanding, and unmistakable. "Turner, I see you found your way home." "Briggs." Jake's grip on his weapon tightened. Ava raised her eyes toward the bridge above, where the figure of a man stood beneath the floodlight. Even from a distance his posture was familiar, rigid, controlled, radiating authority. "Why?" Jake shouted over the storm. "Why drag us back into this?" Briggs's voice came like thunder. "Because you still think like a soldier, but war isn't about sides anymore. It's about survival. Halverson funds what governments fear to admit they need. Soldiers who never die, dogs who never disobey." Ranger growled, teeth bared, as if understanding every word. Ava stepped forward, fury burning behind her voice. "You murdered my father?" Briggs laughed softly. "Your father tried to expose us. He failed. Now you're repeating his mistake." A shot rang out. The metal wall beside them sparked, and Jake pulled Ava down behind a crate. "We're done talking," he hissed. They exchanged a look. Silent agreement born of necessity. Jake tossed a flashbang toward the upper deck. The explosion tore through the rain, blinding the guards. He and Ava sprinted across the deck, firing short, controlled bursts. Ranger lunged ahead, knocking one of the attackers to the ground, his jaws clamped tight. They reached the central stairwell leading below deck. The air there was warmer, heavy with oil and machinery. As they descended, alarms began to wail. Briggs's men were regrouping. They ducked into a side corridor and sealed the hatch behind them. At the far end of the hallway, behind a reinforced glass door, a single chamber glowed faint blue. Inside stood rows of terminals, and on one of the screens flashed a name, Project Revenant, Phase 2. Ava moved closer, scanning the files. "Jake, look at this. They weren't just enhancing animals. They were modifying soldiers." Jake stared at the screen, realization dawning. Briggs wasn't missing in action. He volunteered. Suddenly the lights flickered, and the intercom came alive again. Briggs's voice was closer now, distorted through the speakers. "You shouldn't have come here, Turner, but since you did, I'll show you what the future looks like." The sound of heavy footsteps echoed from above, and a mechanical hiss followed. The floor beneath them began to vibrate. Ava looked up, eyes wide. "What is he doing?" Jake raised his weapon, every instinct screaming. "He's waking it up." Lightning tore across the sky above the Atlantic, lighting the storm-swept cargo vessel in ghostly flashes. The steel hull groaned under the pressure of the rising waves as alarms blared through every corridor. Jake Turner braced himself against the trembling bulkhead, rifle raised, eyes fixed on the sealed chamber ahead. Beside him, Ava Cole worked furiously at a terminal, her fingers moving across lines of encrypted data. Ranger stood between them, his stance tense and silent, ears pricked toward the sound of heavy machinery coming to life below. Somewhere beneath their feet, something enormous was stirring. Commander Briggs's voice filled the ship, low and resonant, vibrating through the metal. "You were trained to fight wars, Turner. I was trained to end them. But Halverson offered me something greater, a way to survive every war that comes next." Jake called out, his voice steady, even as the deck vibrated. "You sold your soul for an experiment." Briggs laughed, a sound like static over the intercom. "I traded weakness for perfection. You'll understand soon." Ava glanced at Jake, her expression grim. "He's overriding the ship's lockdown. Whatever's in that chamber, it's not just machinery. It's alive." Before Jake could respond, the reinforced glass wall in front of them shattered outward in a burst of steam and fluid. The smell of chemicals and metal filled the air. A figure stepped out, massive, human-shaped, but not quite human. Its movements were too precise, too deliberate. Its skin bore faint metallic seams, and its eyes glowed with the same blue light that pulsed through the cables running along the walls. Briggs's voice lowered to a whisper. "Behold Project Revenant." Ava backed away as the creature advanced, her mind racing through possibilities. "He's merged with the neural core," she murmured. "He's not controlling it from the outside. He's inside it." Jake's grip tightened on his weapon. "Then we shut it down from the inside, too." He fired. The rounds struck the creature's chest, sparking but not penetrating. The recoil of each shot echoed through the metal corridors. The creature staggered, but only for a moment, before charging forward with terrifying speed. Jake dove aside as its arm tore through a steel railing. Ranger leapt, teeth clamping on its shoulder, dragging it back just enough for Jake to grab Ava and pull her toward the emergency lift. Sparks rained from the ceiling as power conduits burst open. They tumbled into the lift and slammed the control lever. The doors closed just as the creature's hand struck them, leaving a dent deep as a crater. The lift jerked downward, creaking. Ava leaned against the wall, catching her breath. That thing was human once. The data log said Phase 1 began 5 years ago, right after your unit's mission in Kandahar. Briggs must have volunteered then. Jake nodded grimly. He always wanted control, even over death. The lift stopped at the engineering deck. They stepped into a cavernous space lit by red warning lights. Massive turbines turned slowly, powering the ship's heart. Ava hurried to the main console and connected her tablet. If we can overload the reactor, we can sink the ship before he transfers the data off network. Jake moved toward the stairwell, watching for movement. Do it. I'll buy you time. Ranger followed him, limping slightly from the earlier fight, but alert. The dog's loyalty was unshakable, not just obedience, but something deeper, instinctive. He had known war, known pain, and like Jake, had learned to survive by will alone. Above them, the deck thundered as Briggs moved closer. His voice carried again, louder now, no longer through speakers, but from somewhere near. You can't stop evolution, Turner. You can kill a man, but you can't kill progress. Jake muttered under his breath, We'll see about that. The door burst open, and the Revenant stepped inside, its shadow filling the room. The glowing eyes locked onto Jake. Ava shouted from across the chamber, Almost there! 30 seconds! Jake opened fire again, aiming for the joints, the seams in the metal. The creature shrugged off most of the hits, but slowed as sparks flew from its arm. Ranger lunged again, clamping onto the back of its leg, pulling with all his strength. The creature turned, smashing Ranger against the wall. The dog fell, but immediately struggled to rise, refusing to give in. Jake's heart clenched, fury flooding through him. He charged, slamming a nearby crowbar into the creature's side, then dove for the control panel beside the turbine. Ava, now! Ava hit the final key. The ship roared as the engines went critical. We've got 90 seconds before detonation. Briggs's distorted voice came from the Revenant's throat. If I fall, you fall with me. Jake backed toward Ava, firing again to drive the creature back. The floor trembled. Steam hissed from ruptured pipes. He could see the sea churning through the widening cracks in the hull. Ava shouted, We need to get to the escape boat. They ran, Ranger limping beside them. The alarms turned to a deafening wail. Behind them, the Revenant lunged one final time, dragging itself forward despite the flames crawling up its body. Jake turned, meeting the thing's eyes, and for a moment saw the faintest flicker of humanity, the shadow of the commander he'd once respected. Rest, sir, Jake whispered and fired a final round into the reactor core. The explosion tore through the ship, splitting it open from within. Fire met water as the Atlantic swallowed the metal beast whole. When Jake regained consciousness, he was lying on a floating plank, rain falling gently over him. The storm had broken, leaving only gray skies and drifting debris. He turned his head to see Ava beside him, coughing but alive. Ranger paddled weakly through the water, reaching for them. Jake pulled him onto the plank, holding him close. The dog trembled, but wagged his tail faintly. Ava looked toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to break through. "It's over?" she said quietly. Jake shook his head. "Not over, but maybe it's enough." They drifted in silence, the waves carrying them toward the faint outline of the Florida coast. Somewhere below them, the wreck of the Halverson ship sank into darkness, taking its secrets with it. The ocean would keep them, for now. As the rescue lights approached in the distance, Jake closed his eyes, exhaustion settling deep into his bones. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. He had lost brothers, friends, and faith, but somehow, through all of it, he still had the one thing that had never betrayed him, the loyalty of a dog and the will to do what was right, even when no one was watching. When the storm passed and the sun rose again, Jake looked toward the horizon, a horizon that no longer promised war, but healing. He had seen darkness made by men and machines, but he had also seen something greater, grace, the kind that doesn't come from medals or victory, but from mercy, the quiet hand of God guiding lost souls back to light. He realized that survival itself was a miracle, not born of strength, but of faith. Faith that even in the ruins of man's pride, God still breathed life back into what was broken. Ranger's heartbeat against his arm was proof of that. Every sunrise, every second chance is a whisper from heaven saying, "You are not finished yet." To everyone who hears this story, may it remind you that miracles are not rare. They live in small acts of courage, in forgiveness, in love that refuses to die. In our darkest nights, God still sends us light, sometimes through a loyal friend, sometimes through a stranger's kindness, sometimes through a storm that teaches us how to pray again.